Bree Greenberg LMFT has a passion for creating individual, organizational, and global creative liberatory change. She has been envisioning systems of care that challenge current thinking for 2 decades. With a deep reverence for the mystery of healing, Bree synthesizes many systems to present a breadth of understanding about oppressive systems, addiction, and healthcare that is rarely spoken for. Her knowledge base draws from her extensive experience in transpersonal and systems psychology, contemplative practices, yoga, and Eastern medicine. She teaches large organizations to alchemize change at the deepest levels while creating sustainable systems that aim practitioners and clients towards liberation. Her model lives at the intersection of biochemistry, physics, developmental psychology, and mystical spirituality. Her clarity and compassionate understanding of the challenges we all face as humans brings an honesty to her care, her teaching, and the systems that she designs. She is the founder of the former Vermont Center for Integrative Therapy, which opened in 2010 and was one of the first mental health centers to combine ancient systems of healing interwoven with current cutting-edge systems of care. She is known for her dynamic speaking presence and her ability to weave disparate elements into new forms that change view, conversation, and care. Bree is an adjunct faculty member of Dartmouth and has spoken extensively at institutions, hospitals, conferences, and universities on topics in integrative medicine, eating disorders, and addictions. She has trained and supervised over 150 practitioners from disciplines ranging from internal medicine to yoga therapy. She is also a valued member of the board of directors at Emergence Benefactors in connection with the EPRC.
Thank you so much for being here. And we're thinking the best way to start off, do you want to just tell us about your background, how you got into the line of work you're in, and just tell us about yourself?
Sure. So thanks for that introduction. I'm super excited to be with you guys. It's going to be super fun. So I'm a marriage and family therapist by training. I always do a really bad job about talking about my background because it usually feels fairly irrelevant. But let's see, I started out as a systems therapist. I practiced that way for a little while. And then I started conceiving this idea about expanding the range of the mental health care world and noticing the limitations within the current world, and that was back in the 90s, specifically noticing those limitations with my eating disorder clients who had huge complexity in their system and many different practitioners and no kind of holding or net of care. And so somehow over about 5 years, I started thinking about the problems in the system, both as a practitioner and for my patients, and then beginning to devise a way to solve that problem. And in 2010, I opened the Vermont Center for Integrative Therapy in Northern Vermont, which was a multidisciplinary integrative healthcare center that combined kind of ancient systems of medicine like acupuncture, movement, yoga, meditation, with more modern systems like psychiatry, primary care. So we did that for a decade in Vermont. And I would say that was really turned out to be kind of the beta test of a much broader model for me of what is actually happening in individual and collective systems, meaning individual, familial, cultural, and lineage or ancestral systems, and how those systems are dancing together to create certain conditions or what we call diagnoses and how those diagnoses become unified, identified, and accepted within the collective, and then how our treatment focuses on the symptoms of them rather than on the resolving of the origins of them. And I know a lot of people talk quite a bit about this. You hear a lot of people now speaking about like focusing on root. And of course, we know systems like Chinese medicine always speak about root and always have been. Ayurvedic medicine, any of those old systems have always sourced root. But I would argue or say that we've never lived in such a complex society and still tried to source root. And so we have this interesting dance between the complexity and the ability with technology and globalization to source root from a lot of different factions and factors, while also being overwhelmed with what I label as addictive systems. And I don't narrow those things to kind of classic diagnosable addiction, but I look at addiction as being more the current status of westernization and the ways that we have moved drastically far away from our origins with natural movement and the natural world. And that too has been very colonized. So when I say those words, what I am speaking about is really the movement of the creative through all of us. The generative force of creation that we are and that we never really ever cannot be, and that we can never die from, and that we are born into over and over again, even with certain fated conditions attached to that, or certain karmic patterns that we carry.
Absolutely. That said so much there, especially about addiction as well, and the system itself having this issue with it. So would you say, for example, so someone with severe depression, instead of treating them with medication just to help with feeling really down, instead you'd have this systems approach to care, so that rather than dealing with just feeling sad, it's dealing with like the root of it? Is that part of it too then?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's like looking at where the symptoms of depression fit into the larger picture or the holon or the cosmology of that individual. What role is depression playing there? What is it actually a symptom of? Because most of the time, it's not a symptom of that individual. It's something much bigger. And I'll tell you that 90% of the time, depression itself is a symptom of being in an oppressive society and being in layer upon layer of oppressive systems. And so we internalize that oppression and then oppress ourselves. And part of that is for lineage of belonging. Part of that is because we don't see a way out. I mean, there's many different strands to that. But so just depression as an example has many different possible roots. And it doesn't mean, people often confuse what I say to think that what I'm speaking of is like the end of pharmaceuticals. I've never said that, and I don't believe that to be true. But I believe that there's a strategic place for the use of any and all interventions or methodologies. And because we don't have the right landscape or the right aim, we are using methodologies more randomly and less strategically. And when they are used as part of a larger system, we are choosing how we are using and applying those things. And we aren't in charge of that. We are in charge of listening to a system so it tells us. And that is a very different stance than the way we're currently doing it.
It's beautifully said. Mariam, do you have any questions?
Everything that Bree says is always so fascinating to me. I'm often like kind of dumbstruck by what she's saying. And it's like, wow, I need to absorb all of this. But there were a couple things that you mentioned that I'm just curious about. The first one is kind of when you started to notice that symptoms were part of some larger structure or formation that was largely invisible. How did you come to that realization? Were you looking at symptoms, even though they looked different, were you seeing the same kind of things in your clients energetically, or was that before you could kind of detect energetic structures? Could you speak to that a little bit?
That's a great question. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I would say that before I was able to see energy in the way that I see energy now, I was already tracking those patterns in clients and in my own system. So everything is a lab for me. There's no like separate lab. This has been my research forever. And so I was already looking at them, but I think what was different was I was looking through the lens of the psychological back then. And partially that was my training, but also that was the world's lens for this. And so it's funny, before I experienced the explosion of energy that I experienced on my retreat 8 years ago, I had already experienced many explosions of energy on other meditation retreats, so it wasn't new to me. But before the dam really broke for me, I would say that I was still really aware that what we labeled as mental health was not a category, and that we were making it a category, and that actually there was a living mental health. There was an aliveness to mental health that was in all of us and wasn't a separate thing that some people engaged with or had going on for them. And that was really when I started to understand that any kind of project, research, or large initiative that I put forward was going to be one that was through the lens of more public health than through like a segmented version of like, we create a mental health clinic and certain people go there. And that was really the breaking point in some of my awareness of my own blueprint of pollinating this model of how it should be available to everybody, that there were no categories here. There were no segments. Everybody was in the same soup, and there were different gradients or experiences that everybody had with those things, but that we were doing a big injustice by segmenting those things.
That's so beautifully said. Yeah, and the obsession with labeling too, and yeah, just naming things. And also, just while you're on the topic, I love how you described like the explosion of energy. And so, I know you've had emergent experiences, but do you feel comfortable talking about sort of what that felt like? I know you're on a retreat, what it brought it on, and some of your other experiences.
Yeah, I mean, that was like the big bang for me, is like the best way that I could kind of describe that experience. I mean, I had been sitting in Theravada Buddhism practices for probably about 20 years prior to that retreat, maybe about 18 years, and had lots of transpersonal or kind of like jhanic experiences on retreats and off of them, but never one that really created a path switch for me. And so I had been experiencing a long, dark night for lack of a better way of terming it. And that particular year, which was 2015, I had already been on one retreat and sat a second one about 6 months later. And anybody who sits retreats, silent retreats, knows that each time you sit a retreat, the conditions are very different. Your incoming conditions are very different. The conditions of the retreat are different, and both co-create your experience. And on this particular retreat, it was very silent for me. So it was hours and hours of sitting in stillness. And at some point towards the end of the retreat, which was very peaceful, I actually just got curious and thought, what is in the silence? And in that moment, in an instant, I heard and perceived vibrating molecules of possibility. And what I didn't know at the time was that it had created what I call a reversal, which is that I had been experiencing a lot of darkness, and in that moment, it became wildly light. And so light and so fast that I started literally burning alive. And when I came back from the retreat 2 days later, that is when, of course, the intensification of those symptoms really took place. And then I went through a long other dark night and in what I call a deep integration phase of those awarenesses and those powers, for lack of a better word. I know Daniel uses that word. And always thought actually that it was going to they would go away. Because you usually hear this, right? Like you go through this thing and then you have this period of integration and then you're a person again. But 8 years later, that never happened for me. So it just alchemized me into a whole different thing altogether. And then it's taken many years to contend with that within the normal frame of living, which does not support that, which we all know. It doesn't support these kinds of experiences. It doesn't understand them. It doesn't understand the integration of them. And it doesn't understand what the successful outcome could look like. And so, of course, by default, I've also now worked with a lot of emergers and thought a lot about how my work with addiction kind of dovetails and dances with emergent experiences and why emergers spend so much time in the dark night and how we can change that by looking at the models that I have mapped and created. And this was not anything I intended to do. This just, I know you guys probably know this woman. Who is she? Jill Bolte Taylor. Do you guys know who that woman is? She's a neuroscientist who had a major stroke, right? Yes. And she wound up, because of her background, she created something new because of the way that danced with her experience of being in the pit of it. And I feel that's what it's been like for me, is that these worlds kind of came together, and it's taught me a bunch about where we're really not seeing and what is really possible that we don't understand is possible.
Absolutely. That's just so beautifully said. Mariam, do you want to jump in before I say anything?
Of course I do, because we're talking about the Dark Night, my favorite topic. Bree, so before I really get into that question about the Dark Night, I kind of want you to first define addiction in a short form, if possible, and then how it shows up for emergers after their experience kind of explodes, and if there's a difference between addiction and going through the dark night and kind of what those structures look like underneath.
Okay, there's a lot I could say about that, but I'll try and be succinct, which is that there's three things I'm going to say. One is that to me, addiction is a template for relating. So it's a base template for relating that actually is a combination of many different patterns into a wide net or cosmology of relating. So it sources from, let's say, one central root, and that main central root is disconnection or separation from love. And when I use the word love, I don't mean the feeling of love, I mean the source of power, the source of existence, right? The very source of existence, which is even deeper than worthiness. Often we talk about the roots of addiction as being unworthy or connected with shame. So yes, that's true here, that's close to the base, but underneath that is actual just existence, which is neutral, right? It's just the state of existing exactly as existence is pumping itself out all the time. And so we're many degrees above that, let's say, in a map, usually where we're relating. And so that relating knows that we are separate and that separate creates a kind of starvation, a global starvation in the system. And that global starvation will attempt to be remediated by what I call survival and compensation patterns. So these are patterns that come into being because or in response to lack of access to love, again, which is power, its various currencies. Lack of access to love could be lack of access to like unconditionality, to being seen, to being like reflected properly.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So when you say love, can we also say existence?
Yes, you can say that. We could say both. I just like the idea of love because love is, both are movement, but love really moves, right? It's an energy of movement. And so there's something about it that has a particular kind of tenderness to it and a particular kind of like neutral responsiveness to it. Whereas I think of existence as just being like a thing that goes like this at the base of creation. It's just breathing. It's just pumping. It's just the erotic life force existing as itself. And so, but love has many different factions of currency, right? One big currency in our society is access to money, access to food, access to base primal body needs, shelter, sexuality, touch, sensuality. These are all things that like we can't exist without. And most of us are existing 80 to 90% without those things. And so what has happened is that we create these adaptive responses. To me, addiction is a mass adaptive response to separation. It's a way that we have, our creative life force has adapted to scarcity by trying to replicate the actual things we would get if we were connected. And so it does that, right? Eating disorders does that amazingly. It will starve you so you have an erotic charge. It will give you or replicate the thing that you actually don't believe you can get because you didn't have access to getting it. And I'm not saying just you, but like 5 generations behind you probably didn't have access to it. And so now there's like this genetic and energetic imprint of that over time. And the bodies, not just the physical body, but the bodies remember that. They know that state of holding. And so they will hold in that pattern over and over and over again. Because that becomes the way, and then that way becomes identified as identity, and then that identity is part of familial and cultural belonging. And now you begin to see how the layers become reified over time. And that reification also is not just strengthened, but hotly defended. Because we love to defend our identities. Because we think we're nothing without them. So what's the way is to become nothing again. But we're terrified of becoming nothing because we think and conceptualize that we will lose everything. But what we are actually losing is the false things that we have built, the exact structure on a foundation that was faulty in the first place. And so you have to be able to work with edges to do this, right? You can't do this and stay comfortable. You have to understand what it is to play the edges, because the edges allow you to literally go close to the thing without drowning in it. And this is where it dovetails tremendously with emergence. Now I'm trying to lead to your second piece, right? Which is that, like, how does this dance with emergence? So in emergence, you get this massive infiltration of very high-powered, fast-moving energetics, right? And what does it do? It expands. So it's going to expand a container that has been in some degree of contraction. That's going to blow your shit out of the water. Mm-hmm. Right? And if we don't have models that understand culturally, familially, interpersonal relating from the stance I'm talking about, then we will give you the wrong medicine to try and deal with emergence. We'll try and put it back in the box, right? We'll try and contain it more. It doesn't want to be contained. The goddess is not interested in being contained, right? It's chaos. Chaos wants to self-organize into something new, and then it wants to return to its vastness again until it has decided to create again. And then it's going to dance between those things. I mean, the quantum world knows this. Any scientist knows this in 2 seconds, but we're pretending like it's something new and we're confused by it. And I'm like, dude, this shit's been around forever. This is not new. And then we're wanting to argue about it intellectually, and all of that is a massive time waste because people are drowning while that's happening. And that, we don't have time for that. And this is what I say all the time, is like, look outside. We don't have time for all of these intellectual masturbations. We actually have to get the thing done. It's true.
Hell yes. I'm having an emergent experience listening to you talk. My hands are tingling here. I'm sweating, getting chills in a good way. It's exactly though, like everything you say, absolutely. And that like the beauty and chaos of the expansiveness that you can experience, and how the typical response is, oh, that's not good. Let's, exactly like you said, let's contain it, when really it's something we have to learn from. And these like the challenging experiences and experiences of uncertainty. And all of this is where we grow and learn. And also what you're saying about this desire to hold on to like our identities, and we like take care of them, and this is my identity and I'm like this and this and this, when really we're these fluid changing beings,
Yes.
always in flux. And so I just think that's beautiful. And Mariam, sorry, you had a second part to the question about Dark Night, so I have stuff I want to ask, but if you want to jump into that, go for it.
Yeah, I think Bree's probably going to continue. I did want to ask, so you and I have talked about, Bree, you and I have talked about this like fear of death and the darkness. So is that the letting go of the identity and that edge that you were speaking about?
Yeah, I would say for all of us, the edge really winds up being around death. It winds up being around loss, not just death as an event, but death as the experience of loss. And we in Westernization are a culture that has defended itself against death with massive lines of defense. I mean, that's where the disconnection is from, right? Is that we have built structures, layers and layers of structures, because of our delusion that we can beat death, that we can hold on, that we can own nature. That's what that is, that we can own the natural world. And now we are destroying ourselves because of the arrogance of that delusion. And so in order to really unwind this thing, you have to go back to the fact that death, or the natural movement of change, is the principal factor in being in touch with the creative life force and its movements. And there's a kind of surrender to that has to happen through this process. And addiction is the opposite of that. It's the clawing and holding on, because the fear is so deeply ingrained into us. And I want to say that fear is not just psychological, it is also biological. I mean, we are animal beings. And when animals come close to death, they have a fear response. So, this is not just something you can talk yourself out of. This is something you have to get very intimate with. And that intimacy comes for each of us through different channels in this journey. And many times over, not just once. We keep getting acquainted with death. We keep learning her ways. She keeps showing us what it is to live fully and be her at the same time.
Wow. First of all, oh my God, you need your own university.
No, I don't.
Um, so, Bree, the natural movement of change, is that the same as this Buddhist concept of like impermanence?
Yes, it is. I have to say, I mean, I will admit I had a major path change after that retreat. So my many, many decades of Buddhism turned into like not being the path for me anymore. And I think that's because the path change led to more shamanism. And so much of Western Buddhism has divorced itself from its shamanic roots, even though those are intact, of course, in the system at its origin. And if you studied Buddhism in the East, there's much more of the metaphysical and shamanic kind of pieces that are there. But I think that like impermanence to me is so sanitized. Like there's something about the way that it's presented that still seems so far away from the real thing. And to answer your question for the third time about addiction, I would say that I define it as division with intimacy. And we speak about intimacy usually again as like an event or a state of like something you can develop. But I'm not going to like go out and try to be intimate with you. That's actually no longer intimacy. Intimacy is having nothing between me and everything. It's a closeness with all phenomena, with all of life as it's moving. And that closeness is in connection with a deeply rooted responsiveness that is immediate and has nothing to do with thought or compassion or what you're supposed to do, but literally just acts because you're so available and close that the acting comes through your body in immediacy. And to me, this is so different from the concept of impermanence, which to me feels very intellectual or like categorical. This is deep connection. It's just you are the thing already. That's closer to like the singularity is the 10,000 things. Do you know what I mean? That's that to me, my defining of it is closer to like the one thing is the 10,000 things. Like I am everything. There's no separation. And so it's closer to living that, I think, than conceiving of that.
I'm so glad you said all those things. Wow. And I think maybe this is a good segue for now talking about what happens in emergence and why emergers get stuck in the dark night.
I mean, I think emergers so the dark night is an incubation process, right? Like we all understand that that's part of what happens is that like in order to create alchemically a different state of being or relating and a different physics energetically within your bodies, there has to be a period of incubation or separation from everything else so that you can bake the thing. I think there's no problem with that. That's as old as time. The problem with that, I think, is that emergers attempt to do that and are often forced to do that within a world that doesn't support what's on the other side of that. So that's a problem, is that like they're trying to incubate a whole different way while everybody around them is living the old way, and that's extremely difficult. They're also usually doing it completely alone, like with no network or teachers or support for them to understand the path. You know, you're moving from a self-involved or narcissistic system internally to an ecosystemic intrapersonal system. That's where the journey's taking you, is from an internally networked system that is self-referencing to one that is more ecosystemic and all networked and responsive. So we have the wrong setup for that to happen. So I think that's part of the problem as well.
Yeah.
The other part of the problem is that we have these base addictive templates for relating, and they live in us as much as they live in the external world, and they are deeply afraid of and resistant to death. And so when you start experiencing the chaos of the emergent, you're going to be freaked out. And what is your system going to do? Clamp down on it. And it's going to attempt to do all the things that it used to do before emergence to deal with the problem. And it doesn't help that everybody around you will give you the same advice in general. And so I believe now that a key part of successful emergence is being able to understand how these relational templates work and to be working them during emergence purposefully. And even better, we should be working them before emergence. Because what will happen then is if you go off to do your ayahuasca retreat or you take a bunch of psychedelics, you are going to be using those things strategically in the service of this decoupling, rather than as a medicinal to get you out of the thing that you think you're stuck in. No amount of divine energy is going to break you out of an addictive system. This is what I've learned. We think that we can emerge out of this and that the divine is going to make this whole system go away. You have to work it as a human. It's a human invention, this thing. It's not organic. And so it's not going to be remediated through just a bunch of divine energy. Now you're left with a ton of powers and divine energy and a system that's belief system is rooted in something other than that. And that's where those two are coming up against each other, and it doesn't work. It's like I've said to you so many times, Mariam, you can't have an emergence and be a capitalist. It just doesn't work anymore. What will happen is that capitalism will basically try to colonize the thing that is uncontainable. And the thing that is uncontainable will wait. Listen, it's not going anywhere. It's going to patiently wait, and it will start destroying you while it's waiting.
Totally.
And every emerger knows this, right? It will just start eating you. It doesn't care, because it really doesn't care for your life at all. It's not personal. It doesn't give a shit. It's just doing what it does, which is that it consumes, destroys, and creates, period. And so you get to decide how you're going to engage with it. And if you decide to engage with it in a way that's full of resistance and you want to fuck with the thing, it's going to be like, sure, I'll wait as long as you need. And if you die, I'll just come back in again and we'll try again. Because you're disposable. In the cosmos, you're one moment. Doesn't matter.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think then, because you just have such an amazing way with words, and so I'm curious too about the use of language, because you seem to really, really careful about the words you choose when you're talking about this. So do you find that that's sort of key when you're talking about this sort of thing, and when we're looking into changes in the system and changing people's minds? Do you think language is important for that?
I think that the selection of language, for me, feels like it flows from the energy that will select the terminology that feels most aligned with what it's trying to transmit. And I think, because I'm a lover of language like you, I was an English major, and I love words, and I love language and I love poetry. So I think there's a specificity to that that's very elegant and allows language to transcend rather than just communicate. And I think we have overused language, and we have substituted language and the intellect for a kind of transmission that is much subtler and much deeper and much more complex. And I think that we should be backpedaling on language and up-leveling on things like silence and dancing. Because there's a transmission that comes from those places that can't ever be interpreted.
Definitely. That also makes me think of when you were talking earlier, Mariam, you asked about existence versus love, and Bree, you were talking about love and like the movement involved, and so the word emotion itself, right? It's the word motion in it, and this like, again, that aliveness, and then the importance of the body, and how language on the one hand can be so useful, the other hand, it can be completely destructive and so hard. So again, like you say too, I think ways where we can communicate through the body instead are so important too. Which is, would you say that's why yoga is so important to you too? As it allows you to?
Yeah, I mean, I think too. I'll say this, Bryn, with what you're saying, like we have substituted practices for the thing. And so we are a society that is obsessed with healing and practices as addiction. That's a form of addiction. And so to me, the practices, and if you ask any long practicing Buddhist, they'll tell you this. The practices are the practice for the states that you actually attain once you've passed certain thresholds. And then you don't use the practices those ways anymore. Then you're using energetic scaffolding or practices of like hygiene and like caretaking for your being. But at some point, this thing has a train that once it leaves the station, it's going anyway. And so you don't need to cultivate anymore. We love to cultivate. And so yoga is really a practice of cultivation of like certain states and energies that should lead you to places where you have awakenings with the transcendent and with what is true, what is real and what is true, what is behind the veil, what is stripped of all of the rest. And that those seeings innervate your being deeply enough so that you are living from that place in unity with it rather than in a separation from it. And so now, to me, the most interesting part is how if I'm in conversation, the energy is dancing its way through the conversation, and it's orchestrating all of us to be in some co-creative process. There's no practice for that. Do you know what I mean? Like, no yoga is going to like create the conditions that do that exactly. It's how you develop that inside of yourself, which is a certain maturity that happens over time when you have to integrate these things and when you have a certain integrity around your way of living that allows these to become more fruitioned within you.
Absolutely. Mariam, did you have anything you want to jump in with?
You were talking about the Western society's defense against death and like the holding on to certain states or what we think we need as a form of addiction. Maybe I got that wrong, but I wanted to know how. So you and I have had conversations, and you have explained how these processes are processes of maturation. Is this holding on to due to not completing the process of maturation?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. We have a society that is used to a certain apprehended maturation. And I would say it's apprehended at what I call early adolescence. And part of this is because we have a society that is built on like hierarchical structures where everybody is out for themselves. So we have lost the communal structures that honored elders, that honored the lineages of teaching and learning and the practice and discipline over time of development of things, development of the inner system, readiness at certain thresholds. We've eliminated almost all of that. The only places where you still find some of that now is within organized religion, right? In general. And even there, we've gotten rid of most of it. And so we've lost the internal states of discipline that it takes to actually be patient, to learn, to understand, to grow, to incubate. And we know that we can get things quickly and immediately. We can buy them. We can take a pill to have them. We can go to a weekend shaman class and get certified. And so these shortcuts, I mean, it's funny, but it's actually like crippling. And so these shortcuts have deeply impacted us over time. And we have become used to such a low threshold for maturation that we have forgotten what real maturity looks like and what it really takes to get there, the kind of hours of dedication and practice that it takes to get there, right? You used to want to become like a plumber, and what would you do? You'd spend so much time mentoring under somebody, right? It wouldn't just be getting a certification, and you would put in this time with like less money paid to you or unpaid, and you would understand that at the end of that there was something that you had matured into that you could represent yourself well by doing. We've lost all of that because you can buy everything in 12 seconds. And so we think this is so good, but in actuality, this has crippled us so deeply. And this is why we are so stuck at adolescence. It's why, forgive me for saying this, it's why everybody's trauma body is going to an ayahuasca retreat to find the fix. And listen, I don't blame them because there's so much suffering. But we don't understand that the fix doesn't come that way. We need to front load these things with real maturation, real practices, real understanding of maturity. Then you can walk into the thing and you can use it well in your system and you won't get blown out or shorted out by it. But we have no institutes for this. We have no places for people to come. And listen, when you tell them they have to come, they're like, I don't need to because I could do the 10-hour thing over here. And so it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell. You have to really want honesty. You have to want it in your whole being. And you have to want it and give your life for it, right? And know that it might not just be one lifetime. And there's a taste for that. And we've lost our taste for it. And so I think if I do anything, it's reminding people of what that journey actually leads to and that their taste is still there, but they've just lost their connection with it. And that it's still possible, that it's still attainable, very, very much.
I love the word journey too, because it is that, and that's one of the concerns with the increasing popularity of psychedelics and then AR and VR that can get you to that same place that a psychedelic could. Is that's why I've often asked people, because it is useful, but it's then you don't have the context or the background. You get there immediately, and then what do I do with this state? Whereas what you say, yeah, it's like it's practice and very effortful practice, and so I think that's so important right now. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, to me, that's the biggest risk with all of these things coming into play. Like, I don't think any of them are bad, but I think we're doing them within a context of a deeply addicted and immature society. And that, to me, is extremely dangerous. Because if you give people an easy pill or an easy way right now, at least in the current conditions, they're going to take it. 90% of people are going to take it. even if you tell them it's not going to lead them to the full fruition of the place. And that's a problem.
Yeah. Is that also like what you were saying about the journey and the maturation and all that? Is that why you got into working with adolescent girls as well? Because of that, recognizing at that stage is kind of when you really need to. Yeah. Could you say more about that too? Because that work you do is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it started with adolescent girls because I felt that was such a potent time. Like, it's such a liminal space. You're no longer like a child, but you're also not quite an adult. And the complexity of what's happening there developmentally really sets you up for so much of the rest of your life. And so I loved the richness of that time. And I didn't know anything about eating disorders when I started working with adolescent girls, but I was quickly drawn to like the ones who struggled with it because their asynchrony of development was much stronger and more complex than other presentations. And something about that asynchrony seemed like a... what do you call it when it's not a it was paradoxical, but it was a, oh my God, you guys, what's the E word enigma. It was enigmatic. And so there was something very enigmatic about eating disorders where like each time you tried to figure it out, you weren't really getting to the thing. And of course that's like, I'm like a moth to a flame there. Like personality wise, it's like, oh, no one can figure that out. Oh, I'm making a beeline for that. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh, please take me there. Take me down that rabbit hole for 20 years. And so I did. I went down that rabbit hole for like 20 years. And I really feel deeply like grateful to the rabbit hole of eating disorders, which really opened up the landscape of all of mental health for me. And showed me what was possible with diagnoses that were not as complex and were not as deeply societally rooted. Eating disorders are deeply societally rooted, and not just because of body image and not just because of dieting culture, but because they beautifully and elegantly replicate the conditions of the patriarchy and capitalism in somebody's bodies. They are the exact imprint of those things.
Is this the colonization?
Yes.
Aspect? Okay.
Yes, I would say that it's the way that we embrace what is threatening us. There's an aspect of systemic oppression and threat where we become the replication of the threat itself in order to have power over it and within it. It is fascinating. We're like, oh my God, like I feel helpless in the face of this. So I am going to internalize. I'm going to eat the whole thing and I'm going to produce the exact same conditions. And now I'm going to call it mine. And that's a way that then I can have some power and agency within it. The problem is that it is a destructive paradigm rather than a constructive paradigm. And at some point, any destructive paradigm will not actually move the needle forward. So it will keep you feeling like you're moving and like you're producing and you're doing something, but maturation actually cannot happen within that system because it is built against maturation rather than in service to it.
Wow. I'm curious is there something in the higher consciousness of that being that karmically would like to experience or solve, quote unquote, the experience of the eating disorder?
So I would say there's something in the higher consciousness of all of us that wants to solve the thing that the eating disorder is so beautifully replicating.
I see.
Yes, every one of us. And in an eating disorder, most of the time, what's trying to be solved is exactly what you just pointed to, but also the family lineage of this. It is the enslavement of many, many generations behind it and also in front of it that it is trying to basically be the canary in the coal mine for. And so it's calling out this false limitation. Addictions are false limitations. We are truly unlimited, and in the natural world, of course, there are limitations, right? There are natural limitations. There are natural thresholds. There are natural barriers. Those are not the same limitations that Westernization or our society or forms of dominance culture has put in place in order to create hierarchical systems to feed off of some while liberating or giving power to others. Eating disorders are screaming out, this is not enough. Mm-hmm. They're screaming out, this has never been enough. And so if we take somebody who is struggling with an eating disorder and we misinterpret the signals of that as being a disorder or something that that person is doing in order to be seen or whatever, their family, childhood. Yes, to all of those things. Yes, I'm not saying those things don't exist. But if we misrepresent it as being only about those things, we will not reach deep enough to free that person within them. And the whole point is not just to free them, but to free the whole pattern. Because it's not their pattern, it's the whole lineage's pattern. Whether it looked like an eating disorder before, or whether it looked like sex addiction, or whether it looked like too much meditation, or whether it looked like drinking, or whether it looked like, working a lot, which was socially acceptable. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. It's so dumb.
So is it safe to say then it ends up not really being what we call the disorder or the symptom? It's really the conditions.
It's really the conditions. And it's the way the conditions have formed a certain relational structure or an architecture within you that becomes very hard to break. The energetic architecture has certain places, just like a building, where it has certain windows, certain doors that you are habituated to go through and use. And the changing of that architecture actually needs a particular kind of energy in order to free its constraints and find a different order. This is where emergence actually has massive benefit. Mm-hmm. And can be used strategically through that process.
Absolutely. That actually brings me again, so yoga as an emergent practice, and you've defined it as healing and liberation then with that, is that an important?
Yes. Yes. And so my healthcare system basically uses a multidisciplinary team, and it curates care responsively for people as they're going through the maturation process. So it doesn't prescribe one method. It prescribes a landscape that allows an integrated team to be responsively delivering the medicine or the practice that supports that person's asynchronous development through the course of their maturation. Whether that's if they were with us for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, or 6 years, it doesn't matter.
So it's a sequential process.
Yes. And of course, as you know, it's sequential and nonlinear and asynchronous. Yeah. Yeah. And so what I've experimented with, as you guys know, over the last couple of years is there a way to incubate this process and hasten it? Is there a way to take a multidisciplinary team, put people in a closed environment, and I use that word closed loosely because I've experimented with different forms of incubation and closure, but can you incubate the energy so that safely you can move people, let's say 20 or 100 steps forward in the time that it would take to maybe move them one in the past, and that would usually take somewhere between 5 and 10 years. And this is where my research feels the most interesting to me, is like, how fast can we safely do that? How safely can we do it? And what are the longitudinal results of doing that? How long does it last for somebody? How does it get integrated fully? What do they need as aftercare or following? Because this is what I'm super interested in, is how can we get people there because we need them now? Whatever the there is, whatever version of there is for their systems.
Absolutely. What do you think it would take? Like, what kind of changes would it take, and what kind of resources would it take? Like, if you could really get this going and turn it into something?
I mean, I think it could be like I've experimented with proposals to do anything from like one research study with 2 different cohorts, all the way to like an entire statewide healthcare system that would be applied in one area of the state and then would be pollinated in a hub and spoke model throughout the rest of the state. I'm really interested in all my programs in like making them sustainable, so that we're using existing structures, we're using as many existing practitioners as possible, so that training is unified, so that continuing education is unified. I think the biggest challenge is actually not the infrastructure of this or the operational, how do you say? No, making it operational. Yeah, there's a word for that. Operationalizing. I don't know. Anyway, it's not that. The biggest piece here is actually creating a system that will hold the integrity of the model at a scaled version. Because the integrity of this requires a depth of maturity that not that many people have. And so you have to really incubate that in order to make this big enough for it to be scaled and not lose its efficacy. And to me, that's where my research feels like it has to be. The rest of it all feels easily attainable, because everybody knows that we don't have systems that work now. It's not new news. When I started the center in 2010, people still were like under the delusion that our current system was going to work. But COVID really killed that. And now a couple of years past COVID, it's dying even worse. I mean, we have a system that relies on the formulaic for answers. And humans are the least formulaic they have ever been.